The weight of the sovereigns felt good in Jamal's satchel. It had been a solid season's work at sea, and he'd been paid well. Tall and fit, the young man walked from the pier to the crest of the port overlooking the rest of the town. He could see the ancient citadel, the cathedral, and the rows of wealthy merchants' homes that lit the night sky with splendor. Below them, the markets, town square, and taverns were all alive with the sights and sounds of vibrant entertainment and the scents of exotic meats roasting in spices from distant lands. If only half of what Ymir had heard about Kingsport was true, this was the place for him to seek his fortune. This was truly the crossroads of the world. Ymir walked through the night with purpose. He caught the sweet and unmistakable fragrance of jasmine as several cloaked figures walked past him. A young woman with striking red hair turned as she walked, and he caught her blue eyes. She smiled. Someone, perhaps her younger sister, noticed this and started to giggle. But the moment was quickly broken by a stern look from what must have been their very pious and responsible governess. She regarded Ymir up and down with dour and deep disapproval.
"Come along, ladies. It is late,"
the governess said tersely as she tugged at her own habit and hurried her two charges along into the night. Ymir smiled to himself and kept walking. Night services at Kingport Cathedral must have just let out. He was going to like it here, he thought. There would be a time for love, perhaps even a place in society, just as soon as he set himself up in this new place. The sound of 11 bells began to ring out in the town square, interrupting his musing. He was going to have to find lodgings and find them quickly. Ymir changed directions and headed toward the taverns in the labyrinth maze of looming buildings, houses, crates, and carts. The darkness of the night and density of the seaport fog wasn't making the navigation of the unfamiliar town any easier. But Ymir had spent most of his life at sea and in ports. There was little he felt he could not manage, even this pea soup of a night. Walking by what looked to be a farrier's stable, several of the horses shifted on their hooves and marked their perturbance with grunts and snarfs. And there was another sound for a moment too, one of shifting boots.
"Hello!"
Ymir called out into the night.
"If you would pick my pockets, show yourself!"
A shadow seemed to pass quickly by, and some foul feeling came over him. He felt weak a moment, steadying himself against a feed trough. He caught the smell of wet grasses as he inhaled. And then something else, the smell of jasmine. Then the dirty, cobbled street was gone. He suddenly saw himself a wealthy man. He looked into the eyes of his bride. It was the young woman who he had seen earlier. Her eyes were the same. A moment later, he was older and had several fine sons. He was riding on horseback with his wife and their youngest, a daughter with her mother's eyes. And for the first time in a long while, Ymir was content. He barely noticed when the knife slit his throat. Ymir hit the ground hard. He might have seen the sovereigns raining down uselessly around him as the shadow fell on him, consuming him, swallowing him up, and literally starting to bleed the life's blood from his body. He might have, if his eyes had not remained fixed on that one moment of happiness in a far-off point in a distant future that was never to be. A sweet illusion. Ymir only smiled as the light went out of his eyes. The next day, Rosie and her sister Essie played in the morning sunshine. They didn't usually venture far from home without their father, but today was different. He had been out all night hunting and clearing traps of game. Mother allowed them to wait at the outer markets beyond the city gates so they could see him coming over the hills toward home. But Rosie had strict orders to watch after her younger sister. Unfortunately, Essie took every opportunity to live this hard-won moment of freedom to its fullest. Starting with a colossal game of hide-and-seek, one that she was winning at the expense of her sister's nerves.
"Essie!"
shouted Rosie.
"Where are you?"
Her cheeks flushed with annoyance. She glanced around quickly, half looking for her sister and half expecting her furious mother to appear.
"I don't want to play anymore."
She waited. Nothing. just bird chirping, which normally would be a sweet sound to her ears. But today Rosie felt like they were mocking her. "Did you hear me, Essie? I give up!" Essie watched her sister from her hiding place, far off in the large tree at the very edge of the bend. Her fingers found the dark, charred edges where it had recently been struck by lightning. This was thought to be a bad omen, and certainly she would be disciplined harshly for getting so close to it, or even daring to venture out this far alone. But today, the risk was worth it to see her older sister in such a state. Essie grinned from ear to ear and was about to call out to Rosie when she felt a shadow fall over her. She looked back and saw a giant staring at her. She screamed. Hysterical, Essie fell out of her hiding place and plummeted to the ground, only to be caught by her ankle and then lowered gently. Despite this, she continued to gasp and whisper, terribly afraid. Stay back, she cried. Help! Help, Rosie! A moment later, Rosie came running with the kind of protective fury only an older sibling could muster. But she fell stark silent at the sight of the huge man in the dark traveling cloak. I am sorry. It was not my intent to scare you, young ones, said the giant in a surprisingly pleasant voice. I was afraid you might fall, which, of course, you did. Only because of you giant! Essie shot back as she dusted herself off. The giant smiled, relieved that the little girl had only bruised her ego. He seemed about to say something more when a deep, gravelly voice bellowed out behind him. Romello! If the girls were disturbed by the large man, they were twice as disturbed by the appearance of his equally large twin brother. Dressed in an identical dark traveling cloak, this other giant didn't look down once at the girls. He only had his eye on his brother and the sun overhead. We have work to do, brother. The caravan is right behind us. With a smile and a nod, Romello left. The girls watched the strange pair plod around the bend. A moment later, the caravan appeared. Horses, animals, and wagons covered in brightly colored fabrics passed by Essie and Rosie on their way to the large clearing outside the main city gates. Atop the wagon sat people of all shapes and sizes and walks of life. Some smiled at the two girls. Some tossed them sweets, small flowers, and little gifts. And the music, the most joyful kind of strange and exciting melodies, seemed the perfect companion for a long train of traveling entertainers. The trouble that had set these two girls off before was soon replaced by smiles and wonder. This was something they had never seen. When father comes back, I want him to take us see them, said Essie. Rosie did not respond in kind. Something had caught the elder sister's attention. Listen, Rosie said, looking around. I don't hear the birds anymore. And it was true. They had stopped. And looking at the last wagon, they understood why. Set some distance back, the cart was covered in a strange muted canvas and billowing silks. As it came closer, the wagon carried with it a chill that seeped deep into the bone, as if the very manifestation of death was gliding by. The driver, whoever it was, whatever it was masked and covered in black from head to toe. Even the horses tugging on the cart seemed gaunt and strangely melancholic as they trudged by. Essie and Rosie suddenly felt something else. Like the blackest curtain of night, silent, smothering, still, was still falling all around them. As if the beating heart of life that they were so familiar with had been unnaturally suppressed. As they stood shivering, they now became acutely aware of all the crawling things on the ground beneath their feet. Every dry and desiccated leaf, and the vast cacophony of dead and dying things above and below, all reaching out, stretching, struggling, grasping, not for them, but for what was passing by. By the time night fell, the taverns were abuzz with the news about the winding caravan that had just set up outside the city. Posters littered the town square, promising merriment and amusements from far-off lands. A number of patrons had even caught a glimpse of two large twin brothers with a team of smaller men, setting the enormous pikes to raise the caravan's tents. Kingsport might have been an exciting place, but this traveling troupe was a mysterious and exotic addition with its own sights and sounds and smells, all of which seemed to intrigue the local inhabitants. "They come from all over. Places I've never heard of," a voice said in the darkness. "Traders and performers, I hear. They even have a mystic who can raise the dead. Are you listening, Seamus?" Seamus opened his eyes. He sat at a large open table at the far end of the barking dog. His clothes were not fine or flamboyant, but they were well made, belling his stature as the son of an enormously wealthy merchant. His handsome face had no lines on it, though there were an ever so slight hollowness to his cheeks. His friends, the two flashy young men he was sitting with, had teased him about his plain clothes. But Seamus was hardly in the mood for fun. His mother had died some weeks back, requiring him to return to Kingsport from his studies. He was now caring for his reclusive tyrant of a father, who was as unpleasant and greedy as he was rich. Seamus roused himself from his drink. "I'm sorry, what was that?" "I said they raised the dead," the young man repeated, reading off the parchment posting from the town square. "Here now, shh!" exclaimed a woman, setting down ale mugs from the table, nodding to Seamus. The first young man looked up. He had forgotten about Seamus's mother. "Oh, it's all right," Seamus said, dismissing the herd with a smile. He was used to it with these two, who often ate and drank like they had far more money than sense. Tonight, Seamus was just happy to be out. It seemed like an age since he had been away from the oppressive mood around his family's villa. "Let me see." Seamus eyed the parchment. It was very theatrical, with archaic runes and symbols drawn around the edges. On the left side, images of happiness and light, sunshine and blooming flowers. On the right, images of decay and darkness, bones and mottled flesh. And in the center was a hand-drawn picture of a man, his face obscured but for his eyes, which seemed to burn through the paper. And underneath it read, "Speaker of the dead." Seamus smiled for a moment, bemused. "Well, they should set the local clergy alight." Picking up his ale, Seamus sighed loudly, like a man wanting to forget his cares for a night. He raised the mug to his friends and the powers that be. His eyes automatically wandered down again to the parchment. He read the large name written out on the paper. It said boldly,
"Sorantar,"
called a woman.
"keeper of the balance, prophet and protector of the cycle."
Rael stood in the center of the tent. She was beautiful, riveting, powerful, in mind, body, and spirit. She let her words hang in the air for a moment. She could feel every eye in the crowd on her, as was her intent. She imperceptibly noted the canvas folds flapping along the edges of their tent as more onlookers joined the audience. Rael allowed herself to smile, ever so slightly.
"Sorantar, speaker of the dead."
In that instant, the 7 torches around the room suddenly burst forth in full fiery bloom with a flash and an audible whoosh. And there, standing in the tent, exactly where Rael had been not a moment before, with not another soul around him, was Zoranthar. The crowd could barely register their shock before the man spoke. He was tall and lean, measured in his movement and speech. "Tonight, I present to you our home." A curtain opened to one side of him, revealing a large illuminating map of highlighted land masses and seas, set upon a wheel with notches marked in the wood. "Sanctuary. Its ancient ferment possesses a wealth of secrets, many yet undreamt of. But at the center of this world lies its most guarded secrets of all, the balance between life and death." He stalked his audience as he spoke, measuring every beat.
I have spent a lifetime searching for this knowledge, said Saranther, paying a price few could comprehend.
He locked eyes with a woman in the audience.
Tonight, I am ready to reveal its secrets and, in so doing, impart upon you its significance.
He reached over with his hand and pulled firmly on one side of the large map, sending it spinning like a wheel. To the gasps of the crowd, Rael appeared again and waved her bare arm over its surface, revealing intermittent flashes of silver where there had once only been empty notches. The reflected light from the wheel danced on their faces as Saranther continued.
The wheel of life, and set deep within each spoke, the 7 blades of Thrag-Ul.
As Rael stopped the wheel, she took a few steps forward, engaging the crowd.
Each of the 7 blades embodies the cycle,
she said in a deliberate tone, as Saranther reached over and withdrew the first sword.
From nothing to life, when we are first breathed into existence. Amatos Atratha,
he said in a low, powerful voice, pointing the blade at the nearby urn. From the weapon, a warm energy washed over the room, and a sapling broke the surface of the earth, sprouting before the astonished audience's eyes. Saranther withdrew several more blades and called on their power as the sapling took shape, reaching toward the sky, splitting into branches and bursting new shoots.
As we grow and bloom, we enter the braes of maturity.
Rael paused as Saranther pulled another sword and pointed it at the plant. Again, he said a few words barely above a whisper. This time, the energy poured forth and enveloped the little tree. It grew and twisted and turned, becoming an enormous tree, its roots filling the tent and displacing more than a few onlookers. Their surprised clucks could be heard over the gasps of the crowd. Seeing her moment, Rael walked around the colossal tree that now filled the tent and took her place next to Saranther, offering him another sword.
Then, like all things in this life, we wither. When our time comes, we pass under the veil of death.
She handed Saranther the 6th sword.
Death is the natural end of life, said Saranther. But those who know its secrets have an unnatural burden to bear. We must stand outside this cycle, be responsible for it, but also become one with it.
He pointed the death sword at the plant, saying no words at all. From seemingly far away, a cold wind blew, and all that was warm and good was sucked from the tent. The twisting tree, once so full of life, convulsed, shrank, and died. This process continued until it was completely desiccated and dissolved into nothing before their eyes. Mystified gasps filled the tent as Saranther moved back to the great wheel. For a moment, just a moment, a young man caught his eye, watching him closely from the crowd. There was something intense about this youth, a hunger, but Saranther quickly moved on. Seamus found himself strangely transfixed, compelled even, by the scene unfolding before him. Right away he could tell that Saranther was different than the others. All the conjurers, illusionists, and soothsayers he'd seen in his Kingport youth. He could barely recall their names or talents now. No, for all of this once practiced stagecraft, there seemed to be a purpose in his patter. As if he was captivating the attention of his audience, in keeping them riveted for some other, deeper purpose. And the girl. He couldn't tell what role she played, but Seamus couldn't wrest his eyes from them.
However, lest you think these all mere theatrics,
Saranther continued, sliding the death sword home with a kind of finality.
Rael, my apprentice, will further demonstrate.
The two of them shared a look. To anyone else it would barely be noticed, but Seamus could see in that glance an eternity of trust. Whatever they were about to do carried with it incredible risk. "Are you ready, Rael?" Soranther asked. "I am," she said as she again positioned herself in the center of the room. "Begin." As Soranther spun the wheel of life, the room darkened and thousands of tiny glints of silver filled the tent. Strange music floated above the crowd. Seamus could not see where it was coming from, but it was alluring and seemed to pass right through him. Looking up, he could see that Rael was affected too, and she began to rise off the floor. Bathed in the column of light, Rael slowly turned in the air. Seeing her like this, Seamus now realized how young Rael was. He was trying to place her age when the first convulsion hit her. A ripple of alarm went through the crowd as Rael was taken by the pain. "See now, she dances with the wheel, as we all must, leaving her youth behind." Seamus looked again. It was true. The girl had aged 20 years in an instant. The music intensified, and again Rael was racked in another wave of pain. "But we are powerless to stop the cycle, the advancement of age," continued Soranther. This time she had aged another 20 years. Now the audience cried out, but Soranther did not stop. "The ravages of time are swift, and before we realize it, our time is nearly up." Rael was moving far less. Her hair had become grey and matted. Her breathing labored, and still she turned. The next time the audience saw her face, it was that of an old crone, barely holding on to the thread of life. Each breath was an effort, and any moment could have been her last. Now the audience screamed for it to stop. Not once, not twice, but 3 full times before Soranther spoke again. Even Seamus called out, digging his nails into his palms as he watched the furious intensity. "But the power is hers, as is the wheel and the swords that drive it. Not because she tries to stop the flow, but because she is one with it," said Soranther at last. "Because of this, she can come back from the moment of death and return to the strength of her youth." A sign of relief washed over the crowd as they looked again and saw Rael slowly reversing in age. Her breathing had become calmer and more rhythmic, her face less of a map of agony and ravage. When her feet finally touched the carpet floor of the tent and the last notes of the strange melody played out, the crowd could see that she was fully restored. "For she has learned that it is not the power over life and death that is important, but rather the wisdom and knowledge to be the fulcrum that balances it. That is the way. That is the true power." There was a beat, a long, somewhat uneasy silence that hung in the air, before the crowd spontaneously erupted. A rush of warm air filled the tent as it seemed to come alive, first with desperate applause, and then with excited cheers. Seamus rode the wave upward. He could feel the relief from the crowd, who had been held in such dire suspense. A few of the patrons had even passed out from the prolonged stress of it. This was catharsis. Even Seamus felt it, though he could not place why fully. He clapped loudly, and then whistled, as Soranther and Rael stood on the either side of the slowing wheel of life and let the adulation wash over them. It was the grand finale of grand finales. After the show, Soranther stood in the middle of the empty tent. He looked down at the trampled carpet. So many lost people, he thought. People searching, not finding, not even knowing what they were looking for. He had been that way once, when he had another name, another face. Soranther turned and walked to the wheel, running his hand along the blades. before he had been shown the truth and set on this journey. He wondered if these teachings had reached them. "Where is the seventh?" a voice said behind him. When Sarantha turned, he saw the inquisitive youth from the crowd, now standing in the opening of the tent. "They are 7 blades of Tragul," the young man continued. "There are even 7 places on your wheel, yet you showed only the crowd 6 blades." Sarantha was impressed with his observation. "There is a 7th blade," he said, eyeing the youth closely. "But like the 7th state, it was not meant for man." His tone was calm, pleasant even, but Sarantha had been around a long time. There was an intensity to this young man. He had spotted it very briefly earlier, and now here he was. These were not simply idle questions. This was need. "Who decides this? What mankind can do or see? Or what will become of us?" asked the youth as he slowly walked forward. "Who decides our destiny? Is it not ourselves?" Sarantha considered this as he watched the curious young man. "What we do in the present certainly shapes our future," said Sarantha with a nod. "But in my experience, there is far more to this life than what we see. Pieces in motion that we did not set, and some we cannot comprehend, let alone affect." "I cannot believe that," he said flatly. The words seemed to burst out of him, catching Sarantha off guard. Reading Sarantha's look, the young man seemed to calm a moment. "Please excuse me." But Sarantha simply held up his hand. "No, continue." The youth exhaled. "Sir, my name is Seamus. I've grown up in the shadow of my wealthy and successful father," he explained. "I feel it dogging my every step, the way he's trying to control my life. I thought it inescapable until tonight, but I know now that there is something else, a greater power." Sarantha watched the youth, trying to take him in as he spoke. Then he noticed his eyes going back toward the wheel and the blades. "What I saw here has never been so real," said Seamus, his tone growing more excited again. "The power of life and death." There was a long pause before the young man looked back. "Will you teach me?" It was a question that had been heard many times before. Sarantha studied the young man's face, searching it, and after a moment, he finally said in as compassionate a tone as he could muster, "I do not think so. I am sorry." With that, he turned and walked back toward the wheel, removing the clasp that held the swords in place. "What?" squatted Seamus. Sarantha recognized in it the cry of a desperate young man accustomed to getting his way. "But why not?" he said, walking right up to Sarantha as he worked. "I have the mind for it. I've studied scrolls and books and papers from the greatest philosophers. You cannot know." Sarantha stopped and looked at Seamus. "I see in you the mark that consumes so much of mankind. A desire for life eternal, a lust for the power to command death." "But you're wrong," the young man swallowed hard. "My family," the words were hard for him to get out, "has suffered. Someone close to my heart." His legs were trembling now. Sarantha thought he might have to catch the young man. He appeared so shaken and weak. "If I could just..." But for Sarantha, there could only be one answer. "You do not have balance. It is not in you. I cannot grow what is not there." This hit Seamus hard. He stiffened. "If it's a matter of money..." Sarantha would not dignify his words with an answer. Instead, he did something he had not done in a very long time. He looked at Seamus with pity. That did it. Whatever facade Seamus was trying to keep up, it started to slip away. His cheeks flushed hot with anger as he took a step forward to try to grab Sarantha. Sarantha stepped out of the youth's reach, just as Rael entered the room. She quickly sized up the situation.
Is everything alright, Soranther?
Then, without even waiting for an answer, Rael snapped her fingers. Almost immediately, the twin forms of Romello and Romulo appeared. The massive men dipped their heads as they entered the tent, but once inside, they stood there full, very intimidating height. Sima seemed to cool down, whether because of the implicit threat or just sheer embarrassment Sarantha could not say. Either way, the youth nodded curtly to Sarantha and quickly made his exit. The four of them watched Simus bolt off into the night. Rael couldn't wipe the disgust from her face.
I hate those who hang around.
But Sarantha kept his eye on Simus.
This one, he was different.
Simus slowly made his way up the steps leading to his palatial family home. He was out of breath, only then realizing he'd run the whole way. He cursed having to flee from the caravan, but it wasn't the girl or the two giants who made him leave so abruptly. Maybe it was the shame. How had it all gone so wrong? He took a moment and looked out over the estate. Even at night it was impressive. In its day, with its many rooms, overlooks, grand halls and vineyards, it had taken 100 craftsmen years to build. And yet, in the blink of an eye, it had seemingly collapsed with his mother's passing. Now, the home was gone, but the house still remained. Feeling more himself, he gripped the door handle and pushed his way inside through the colossal doors. Pools of candlelight did little to fight the vast darkness inside the cavernous halls. Simus could make out the statues, oil paintings, and columns of rare imported marble, all plunder and spoil from his father's merchants and shipping empire. Right now, even the sight of it exhausted him. He just wanted to go to bed.
Ah, the prodigal son has returned.
A weak and sickly voice called from the darkness.
Look at you, crawling back here like a cat in the rain.
That's enough, father. I am going to bed. He turned and walked toward the living quarters. His face was getting hot again, and now his templates were throbbing. Simus thought that losing his temper with Saranther was one thing, but with his father, that would be something else. Better to withdraw.
You are a fool, boy. Weak, he continued. Just like your mother.
This made Simus stop dead in his tracks. The old man had gone too far.
What did you say?
But his father just laughed. It was a bark of surprise, mixed with a mock of fear and mucus, more cough than true amusement. For the second time that night, Simus dug his nails into his palms. This time he stopped himself. Then he slowly said something he never thought he would say. I am leaving. This just brought more laughter from the sickly old man.
Leaving? Oh no!
Simus's father cried, his words oozing down the hall and into Simus's ears.
You are my son, my legacy, my property, and you will never be rid of me.
Romello stood on the far side of the encampment closest to the city. He could see the lights through the trees of the forest. The evening was quiet, dark, calm. He liked it like this. Very often when a caravan would set up in a new place, he would be unsure of the surroundings, or the people, or the local customs. This caused him a lot of worry, more than he let on, but he had always been more sensitive to these things. Certainly more so than his brother. Here, for some reason though, he just felt at peace. Even his size didn't seem to be a barrier for once. Maybe, he wondered, if he and Romulo ever stopped traveling with the caravan, they could come back here. And then he would do what he wanted to do most. Plant a farm, raise rabbits, and maybe some livestock. That would be a better life. A chuckle escaped him at the thought of this. It was against his usual nature, but he half wondered what his brother would think when he came back around the bend from town. Even in the midst of the light, he could see the way. There was a burned tree along the edge of the path, its trunk twisted and its branches gnarled. He realized it was the same tree where he had seen the two little girls, just after the caravan had first arrived in town. As he considered this, a shadow seemed to pass over him, and he felt dizzy. A smell then invaded Romello's senses, earthy yet sweet, strong and unmistakable, something he hadn't smelled in a very long time. "Chestnuts," he said, almost involuntarily. He grinned and walked forward, stumbling as he followed this intoxicating aroma. As he rounded the trunk of the burned tree, the giant suddenly saw himself standing only a few paces away by a blazing fire, and from it was coming the most wonderful smoke. He was humming a tune, something he thought he'd forgotten, and happily roasting chestnuts, which were popping and crackling in the heat. Before his eyes, the scene changed and he saw himself again, not much older but more settled, walking into an enormous paddock of rabbits. His rabbit, in his paddock, on his farm, just as he'd always told his brother he would have. He loved these rabbits, and they loved him. He could feel it. A moment later, the giant glanced down to see the two girls, Essie and Rosie. They'd called themselves, at his feet. They smiled up at him sweetly. Neighbors came to visit his stock. The first knife cut severed the tendon of his left leg, the second one, his right. The giant fell to his knees, still smiling, eyes fixed on a point in the distance, a vision of something that would never be. He barely noticed when the knife slit his throat. Romello never saw the shadow that labored over him, drinking his life's blood, and he never noticed his brother, half buried under the leaves nearby. Sarantha woke with a start. He was still seated at his traveling desk, parchment stretched out, his quill loose in his hand. He must have dozed off, he thought. He'd had a dream of being alone in the darkness. Ahead of him was a large ball of churning fire on one side, and a swirling ball of shimmering water on the other, and between them stood a figure wearing a mask. As Arantha approached the figure, he found that he could only get so close, as if some unseen barrier cut between them. He called out to the person on the other side, but they did not respond. Instead, the figure removed its mask. It was Rael. She stretched out her hands to either side of her, pointing to the large swirling orbs. Almost immediately, the fireball leapt across the darkness and consumed her in a pillar of fire. Zoranther tried to run forward, but could not. Then suddenly, the water sphere burst onto the fire, consuming it in an enormous churning waterspout. When Zoranther looked again, Rael was suddenly restored, as were the two spheres. She smiled and again pointed at them on either side. He pondered his dream as he walked from his desk in the wagon to the dimly lit tents. But then something caught his eye on the ornate rugs that covered the floor. A slickness that blended into the crimson colors. He didn't need to touch it to know what it was. Blood. A lot of it. And that it stretched deeper into the room. Sarantha followed it through the pools of light. That's when he noticed that the cabinet by the wheel had been opened, the sword scattered on the ground. He took a step but was stopped by a familiar voice. "Do not come any closer!" Sarantha froze. It was Seamus. "You know what I want. Now you're going to show me everything." Sarantha peered into the darkness to try to locate the youth. "You know my answer. Why would I change it now after this intrusion?" An unspoken tension hung in the air. "Because then I won't kill the girl," Seamus said, walking into the light. He held Rael tightly with his own blade to her throat. His hands were covered in blood.
"You were right,"
Rael said with icy calm.
"This one is different."
Suddenly the room was filled with laughter. It was terrible, sick and self-satisfied, and it didn't belong to the young man with the bloodied hands. As Seamus stepped forward, two gnarled hands opened the young man's robes from the inside. They revealed an old man's face and part of a torso protruding from his bare chest. The skin between them was horribly stretched and marred, and the old man's mouth was dammed with blood and saliva. The sight sickened even Saranther. "You should have listened to my son," spouted the old man.
"Stop this! Please!" said Seamus weakly.
"Oh, it will stop once this magician gives me what I want," cackled the fleshy face.
"I know what you have done," said Saranther. "This is blood magic, fringe sorcery, twisted and perverse. It will carry a heavy cost."
His tone was even, though perhaps sad. Seamus's father was using him as a vessel, literally stealing the life from him. It must have taken great strength to resist his father's grip when the boy had visited him earlier. The inner fight between them must be terrible. Saranther had been right to regard Seamus with such pity. He just hadn't known why.
"Not my cost,"
the old man spat with wearisome glee.
"Not my cost,"
the old man spat with a wearisome glee.
"The boy has been an adequate vessel for the necessary sacrifices to feed my condition."
The monster's yellow and bloodshot eyes suddenly shone with a kind of lust.
"But now, with what you will show me, I will use these blades to restore myself completely. Then, I can shake off this useless husk of a boy and have true revenge on my enemies. I will live forever."
The words fell at the feet of Saranther. The old man saw this and got an idea.
"However, if I not been persuasive,"
he sneered,
"allow me to up the ante."
The blade being held at Rael's throat moved suddenly and cut deeply. She said nothing. It was Seamus who screamed as her body fell to the floor. Saranther could hear Seamus weeping between the breaths as the old man raged.
"There! I'll give you this one chance. If you are truly what you say you are, you will take all you know, all your skills and learning, and use the blades to restore her life, and I shall watch, taking from you your knowledge."
Saranther didn't move an inch towards his fallen apprentice. He didn't raise his hand to Seamus. He simply stood there, took a moment, and closed his eyes. This was what the dream was about. The choice he must make. He was the fulcrum, and balance had to be maintained, whatever the cost. He waited a long moment before he spoke.
"No,"
said Saranther with finality. This was already a word the old man hated. Hearing it now made him seem to despise Saranther even more.
"What? She is your student. You want to bring her back. You need to bring her back," the monster seethed. "Do you not care what happens to her?" "You don't understand,"
Saranther said resolutely, though with a touch of sadness.
"It is because I care that I cannot bring her back. I have walked sanctuary for many centuries. I know what happens when the balance is upset."
Saranther looked down at Rael.
"But I can do this."
He then looked up at Seamus.
"Boy, do you wish to be free of this nightmare?" "You will not answer!"
the old man shouted as he tightened his grip on his son's body, making him gasp in pain. Still, Seamus managed to choke out a single
"Yes."
Saranther closed his eyes and pronounced a string of ancient words under his breath. They had form more than sound, proceeding from Saranther like a tectonic movement from the deepest part of sanctuary. Such were their power. Whatever the response was, it was small at first. Then it came in full. The tent around them began to shift and flap, filling with light from the burning fire that was not there. Seamus and the old man gasped as the blades of Tragul that littered the ground dissolved away in front of them, only to resolve again in their proper places around the wheel of life. A wheel that began to spin again on its own. The large tent danced with 1,000 shards of reflecting firelight.
"What is happening?"
demanded the old man,
his eyes darting in anger and what now looked like fear. Sarantha turned to him.
What you have done is an affront to the balance, the cycle, and to my master Tragul.
Suddenly, there was a sound behind them, then one from the side, and then the other.
You wanted life, and so you took it,
Sarantha continued.
but those from whom you have taken now demand it back.
With that, the half-decayed body of Jameer walked through the flap of the billowing tent. He was a true fright of ooze and worms. Though his face was now barely recognizable and his bones poked through his rotting flesh, the old man knew exactly who he was. The monster recoiled and screamed, forcing Seamus to run to the exit of the other side of the tent. But as they were about to dart out, they were met by Romello. The gash of the giant's neck, though no longer pumping blood, opened and closed horribly as he shambled toward them, holding out his enormous arms as if to grab the old man. Seamus stumbled backward, away from Romello, and right into the huge form of his very dead brother. He too had been slashed and bled, though this time Seamus could see right into his wide open chest wound as the huge man grabbed him by his robes. The monster made Seamus slash at Romello with his blade, first at the dead man's hands and then at his body, but it had no effect. Seamus stabbed more widely, and the blade was finally lodged into the giant's ribcage. It then slipped from Seamus's grasp in the slickness and gore. The old man roared his fear and frustration. Managing to get away again, Seamus and the monster inside him ran again to the back of the tent, but this time they were met by Rael, her throat still oozing, her fingers sharp and fast. She grabbed Seamus and the old man in an iron grip that held like justice. They struggled as the others closed in around them. Now, there was no running. Sarantha approached them with a look of final judgment.
You asked about the seventh blade. It is the blade of damnation, of living death eternal.
He produced a sword and held it before the monster whose greed had consumed so many.
It was not meant for man. It was deemed too cruel,
Sarantha continued.
But now it has found its match in you, vile one. And you have found your faith.
The words exploded in the ears of the old man. He looked deeper into the blade as Sarantha brought it closer to him. Closer and closer. Until he saw himself looking not into its surface, but looking from the inside out. The old man screamed from his very core, and then there was a blinding flash. When Seamus awoke on the floor, he felt that his enormous weight had been lifted from him. With his father gone, he was now unshackled from the putrefying horror that had gripped his body and polluted his soul for so long. Taking his first truly free breaths, the young man looked up to see Sarantha, who smiled.
How do you feel?
Is it over? Asked Seamus, still blurry.
Yes,
said Sarantha.
That which was your father no longer corrupts you.
Seamus felt a twinge of sadness. To his surprise, a tear formed in his eye. The young man wiped it away, or at least he would have if he could have moved his arms.
But the bloody hands that do the killing are as guilty as the heart, even in this matter,
said Sarantha.
Balance must be restored.
It was then that Seamus realized that he was in a circle of some kind, drawn on the floor in blood, and everywhere his body touched his rings, he was held fast. A rush of panic flooded Seamus. As his eyes whipped around the room, he saw the risen and decaying bodies of his earlier nightmares, the two giants, the sailor, and the strangely beautiful girl, all standing around him in mute testimony.
And I must be the fulcrum,
Sarantha sighed.
I am sorry, boy.
Seamus struggled. He tried to cry out. His mind flashed on every thought that sprang to his defense. He barely noticed when the knife slit his throat. Sarantha stood up. wiping the blood from his bone dagger. He looked into Rael's cold eyes one last time. "This is where our road ends," he said. "Rest well." She stood a moment longer, and then, as if satisfied, she and the others seemed to give up their animas, their spirits, and fall lifeless onto the floor. Sarantha regarded them as they lay on the blood-soaked carpet with a certain sad satisfaction. Their lives had been cut short so needlessly, and yet, now they had also found peace, something that even he did not truly have. He felt a pang somewhere deep inside, something indescribable, yet he knew that it was dangerous to envy the dead, and there was still so much to do. This would have to suffice for tonight. He was done. Sarantha stood in the moment, surveying the crowd in the tent. There was a silence. It was another town, another night. But this night, his apprentice was not with him. He now did alone all the things that they had done together before. He spoke of the power of life and death, the discipline of what he knew as necromancy, and the importance of balance. This was the key, the vital thing that money could not buy, that the powerful could not control, and that force could not take. This was also the first night that Rael did not push herself to the brink of death as she had done so many times before, because she was now fully and deeply embraced by it. Instead, for the finale, Sarantha withdrew from the wheel the seventh blade of damnation, intending to conjure forth the corrupted spirit held within it. Sarantha was careful to point out that this spirit and its fate were both unusual. It was a rare thing for someone to be held outside of the great cycle of life and death. But so cruel and offensive to the natural order of things were this individual's crimes that he truly deserved this equally cruel and unnatural fate. Sarantha never knew his name, just that a poor young man once called him father, and that this would be his final place of interment. Forever. Sarantha then spoke the words. What appeared before the crowd was more terrifying and blood-curdling than anything he'd ever shown before. The ghostly form of an old man's soul in searing, constant, and eternal torture issued forth, howling agonized screams and bitter lamentations. He was so horrifying, so gut-wrenching, so heart-stopping that some people had to be carried out from the fright of it. That was one way to make them listen. And so now there was silence, a gulf of furrowed brows, shocked stares, and held breath. But it was only for a moment. For when the rush and roar of relief and amazement finally did come from the crowd, it was staggering. Even Sarantha was surprised. Sarantha thought about tomorrow, when he would load up his tents and move on to the next town. When this journey he had been set upon, his personal quest, would continue. And the caravan with all its secrets and stories would carve its way across the face of Sanctuary, like the very image of the great dragon Tragoul against the night skies. In hope of saving more wayward souls and spreading the teachings of his kind, he would play the part of the entertainer for now, speaker of the dead, prophet and protector of the cycle, keeper of the balance.